different national and cultural and religious identifications, but also to see those differences between the US and Canada. And I suspect there may be many questions following up on that. For our next speaker, we're going to have Robert Bashara, and Robert is a doctoral candidate at the Consciousness and Society at the University of West Georgia, where he researches the psychology of Islamophobia in the United States, and he takes a very different approach, employing critical theory and qualitative methods. And he's published on a number of topics: cinema, consciousness, the internet, emotion, psychoanalysis, and he's also a fine artist with experience in theater, music, and film. And he's going to put those together, I think, today. I'm waiting to see, like the rest of you, when he tries to sort of establish an archeology of terrorism. In doing so, he's going to think about some of the complexities in the production of Islamophobia, as well as some of the effects of counterterrorism. So in some ways, I'm hoping he's going to tie together the past two speakers really well. So with that burden, here you go. Go for it, Robert.
All right, greetings everyone. Thank you for choosing to be here instead of napping. Let me preface my paper by saying that I'm very happy to be here among all of you because, first of all, my wife is here, and yesterday was our anniversary, so last year I was here for the conference and she wasn't able to come, so I was lonely a little bit. Also, I want to thank Dr. Blazian and company, of course, for organizing this conference. So today I'll highlight sections of a theoretical paper, so take a deep breath. I wrote this for the conference, so I'm going to hope to address the theme of the conference, and then I didn't hear anyone really theorize about the sort of subjectivity of the Islamophobe, which is something I kind of try to talk about. All right, so let's get to it. Okay, so just to give you an overview, why are terrorism and Islamophobia contested concepts, and what should we do about that? In this paper, I attempt to do an archaeology of terrorism in order to answer these questions, and also in an effort to map out multiple subject positions afforded by the war on terror. Along the way, I deconstruct the binarism of said Orientalist discourse and problematize the political media complex's role in the production of Islamophobia. Then I ask the following methodological question: how are we to know that a tipping point has been or will be reached? Finally, I consider some of the contingent ramifications of a marriage between the American ideology of exceptionalism and the counterterrorism discourse, namely Islamophobia, as both a fundamental fantasy and a counter-discourse. So these are the things that I explore in the paper. The things in bold are the ones I'm going to really highlight here, because I don't have time to go through everything. Okay. So, terrorism and Islamophobia indeed signify contested concepts. The main assumption behind this criticism is that the world would have been a better place if academics had agreed once and for all on their definitions of terrorism and Islamophobia. However, since we know from semiotics that all signs are arbitrary, why then are critics so concerned with the meaning of these concepts when we know that meaning is relational or differential rather than referential? In other words, in studying these concepts, we should pay more attention to the signifiers themselves, particularly in the relation to other signifiers as opposed to what is signified. That way we can come to understand chains of signification as contingencies or products of a certain language, culture, and historical moment. As a result, my reading of Islamophobia is always in relation to terrorism. Nevertheless, emphasizing signifiers over concepts does not mean that we abandon questions of reality and truth. Following Peirce's triadic model with equivalent terms from Saussure, we can skillfully break down any sign into three parts. The representamen or signifier, an interpretant or signified, and an object or referent. The third part of Peirce's model in particular the object, allows for the possibility that terrorism and Islamophobia as science do not only signify contested concepts, but also refer to uncontested realities, which I understand to be discursive material objects. So according to one of the experts, in quotes, on the topic, terrorism is a contested concept. While there are many national and regional definitions, there is no universal legal definition approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. In the absence of a legal definition, attempts have been made since the 1980s to reach agreement on an academic consensus definition. The revised, this is what it's called, it's pretty long, the revised academic consensus definition of terrorism, which was compiled by Schmidt, include 12 articles, so the definition is pretty long. This is a conservative number in comparison to the 260 other definitions compiled by Schmidt in the Routledge Handbook of Terrorism Research. So clearly there's no agreement, right, on this term. Allow me to highlight the first article out of the 12 in the revised academic consensus definition of terrorism. So you can kind of skim through it. I'm not going to read it. Even though Schmidt admits that terrorism is a contested concept, he does not confess much terrorism research adopts state-centric priorities and perspectives and tends to reproduce a limited set of assumptions and narratives about the nature, causes, and responses to terrorism. In writing about the core commitments of critical terrorism studies, Jackson provides us with an alternative definition of terrorism which problematizes the revised academic consensus definition of terrorism as inherently ideological. CTS views terrorism fundamentally as a strategy or tactic of political violence that can be, and frequently is, employed by both state and non-state actors, and during times of war and peace. To put it another way, war is political violence perpetrated by state actors, while terrorism is political violence perpetrated by non-state actors. There are two principles when it comes to conducting general history. Archaeological research is both non-interpretive and non-anthropological. This means that the archaeological researcher remains at the level of appearances and that she or he concentrates on statements and visibilities as opposed to searching for authors. I will now turn to the discursive object of terrorism while bearing in mind that archaeology is the process of investigating the archives of discourse. According to Rappaport, there are four recognizable waves in the history of terrorism: an anarchist wave in the 1880s, an anti-colonialist wave in the 1920s, a new leftist wave in the 1960s, and a religious wave starting in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. This history suggests that the current wave of Islamic terrorism will eventually fade away to be replaced by a fifth wave. Perhaps, I argue, cyber terrorism. What this chronology also suggests is that there's no logical or inherent connection between terrorism and Islam, or terrorists and Muslims. Rappaport acknowledges that the origin of the sign, terrorism, dates back to the French Revolution in the late 18th century, but he does not do an in-depth investigation of the reign of terror. He only mentions it in the context of modern rebel terrorism, by claiming that anarchist terrorists in the late 19th century were either inspired by the French Revolution or the Order of Assassins in medieval Islam. According to Kendall and Wickham, archaeological research attempts to do 7 things, which they label the 7 tasks. I go through them in detail in the paper, so I'm just going to highlight number 4, the positions which are established between subjects in regard to their statements. So the war on terror, similar to Orientalism, operates based on the following binary, hence imperialist logic, which is captured succinctly in these unforgettable words from Bush, right after the tragic events of September 11, 2001. Either you're with us, or you're with the terrorists. However, a quick structural analysis using Remus's semiotic square will reveal that the war on terror discourse actually affords multiple subject positions, which means that the discursive problem of terrorism is premised on a false dilemma which can be easily deconstructed. In fact, the counterterrorism discourse produces not 2 but 4 subject positions. So as I read this, try to follow the S1, S2, not S1, not S2. So terrorists, S1, counter-terrorists, S2, these are the subject positions, not counter-terrorists, not S2, and not terrorists, not S1. So obviously the dominant discourse just highlights S1 and S2, and we have to choose between those two, while there are possibly more positions that we can choose from. So, and there are 6 relationships based on the following 3 principles: contrariety, contradiction, and complementarity. To demonstrate, just to make this more concrete, terrorists and counter-terrorists are in violent opposition to one another, while not counter-terrorists and not terrorists are in non-violent opposition to one another. Contrariety means that they cannot both be true. Being a not counter-terrorist implies being a terrorist, which explains Islamophobia. So basically, if you focus on the relationship between S2 and not S2, this is a helpful way to kind of understand how Islamophobia works. Islamophobia, for example, Muslims or Muslim-looking subjects as the enemy within, right? So a not terrorist could be a non-violent resistor, but this subject position, not S1, implies being a non-expert, hence illegitimate counter-terrorist. The remaining 2 relationships are contradictory, i.e. the truth of one implies the falsity of the other, and conversely. It is worth noting that S indexes fear and violence, while not S indexes fearlessness and non-violence. And I sort of focus on the language itself because it's embedded with all of these affective tones. Okay, jumping forward. So has Islamophobia reached a tipping point? I'm glad that Dr. Khan actually referred to Gladwell. I assumed that more people would do that, and I found that he's the only one who made that reference. So I'm going to build on that. Gladwell is credited for popularizing the concept of the tipping point. He defines the tipping point as the moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point. Then he goes on to list the 3 characteristics of tipping points: contagiousness. Little causes can have big effects, and change happens not gradually, but at one dramatic moment. Gladwell's whole book is premised on the following foundational analogy. Certain psychosocial and biological phenomena are structurally similar in terms of how they dramatically change. Following this logic, we are encouraged to think of Islamophobia as a social epidemic because we are told, quote, ideas and products and messages and behaviors spread just like viruses do. So the question becomes, are Americans infected with Islamophobia? And if so, what is the cure? If Islamophobia is about to reach or has indeed reached a tipping point, then we should feel happy, because that would mean that what follows is a steep decline in anti-Muslim racism. However, I do not think we are there yet, but perhaps if we apply Gladwell's 3 rules of epidemics to Islamophobia, we can assess its current status, at least in the United States. The law of the few. According to the first rule of epidemics, the law of the few, social epidemics are driven by the efforts of a handful of exceptional people. We can see that this agent of change is applicable in our case, since Islamophobia is sustained by both the Islamophobia industry and the terrorism experts industry, whose functions are to sell the public misinformation about Muslims, Islam, and terrorism, respectively. According to the second rule of epidemics, the stickiness factor, there are specific ways of making a contagious message memorable. There are relatively simple changes in the presentation and structuring of information that can make a big difference in how much of an impact it makes. 9/11 is exemplar of a memorable, albeit tragic, event. It was a collective trauma whose spectacular images in the media will haunt us for life. Islamophobia is sticky as a result of the political media complex's capitalization on the suffering of millions of Americans. Since, and arguably before 9/11, the political media complex has been and still is selling to the public the following falsism. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Islamophobia's stickiness then is achieved through ideologies and discourses of othering. On the one hand, ideological mechanisms by the media industries render the public desensitized to the aestheticization of violence. On the other hand, we become docile bodies when we are positioned as subjects of a hegemonic and binary discourse, which manufactures consent through a politics of fear. The ideologies of othering are sustained by myths of exceptionalism, while the discourses of othering index grand narratives of holy war. These are themes that have been sort of touched upon in previous presentations. To put it differently, Islamophobia is contagious because the war on terror is rhetorically powerful. Therefore, as scholar activists, we have a tremendous responsibility of not only theorizing about counter-ideologies and counter-discourses, but more importantly, we need to conceive of an ethically sound praxis of resistance. According to the third and final rule of epidemics, the power of context, human beings are a lot more sensitive to their environment than they seem. When discussing this agent of change, Gladwell invokes the bystander effect from social psychology to show how others influence our behavior. But another more powerful way of describing context can be achieved through a reading of general history. In conclusion, the social epidemic of Islamophobia will tip or be jolted out of equilibrium, according to Gladwell, when some change has occurred in one or two or three of those agents of changes listed above. I imagine that the tipping point for Islamophobia will occur when the counterterrorism discourse significantly shifts or when it completely loses its legitimacy. Hence, I suggest that we drop the biological metaphor in favor of doing archaeology of counterterrorism, since it is precisely this discourse which structures Islamophobia as a fundamental fantasy. Scholars have traditionally compared Islamophobia to other related phenomena, such as xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, Orientalism, even though Islamophobia is not a new term since one can trace it to the early 20th century. It is a relatively recent field of study which dates back to the publication of the Runnymede Trust report in 1997. In an effort to understand Islamophobia as a fundamental fantasy, I will specifically compare the phenomenon to racism and anti-Semitism using the lens of Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I'm just going to focus on anti-Semitism. So in this section, I'm using Zizek's lucid description of the 7 veils, and that's his word, which is an interesting choice. 7 veils of fantasy, particularly his examples of anti-Semitism. Again, I use his 7 veils as tools to analyze Islamophobia as a fundamental fantasy and see if it actually works. This can help us explain the Islamophobe in terms of their psychic structure. To conceptualize, so these are the 7 veils, and so my argument is as follows. I'm going to focus specifically on the fantasy has 2 dimensions, the one in bold. So my argument is as follows. Pseudo-patriotism, or national identity as fear of the other, was a reaction formation to 9/11. In other words, when the desire for American exceptionalism meets the drive to kill terrorists, Islamophobia materializes as a fundamental fantasy, which can be traversed either in the battlefield or the clinic. If not traversed, Islamophobic symptoms resurface on a cultural level, signaling the return of the repressed. So here, as you can see in my model, I'm looking at the relationship between ideology and discourse, and then how that has with that fantasy of Islamophobia in the Islamophobe's mind. In the introduction to his chapter, Zizek tells us fantasy conceals the horror of the real, yet at the same time it creates what it purports to conceal, namely its repressed point of reference. It is not easy to describe fantasy because it is inherently paradoxical. For example, thinking one is whole, while in reality being fragmentary. In order for a fantasy to be operative, it has to remain implicit, i.e. the distance must be maintained between it and the explicit symbolic texture sustained by it. For this distance to be maintained, fantasy produces a gap that forever separates the phantasmatic kernel of the subject's being from the more superficial modes of his or her symbolic and or imaginary identifications. Covering this gap, fantasy is the screen that separates the Islamophobe's desire for exceptionalism from his death drive. In his segment on the difference between desire and drive in relation to fantasy, Zizek contends that in the Islamophobic ideological fantasy, social antagonism is explained away by the reference to the Muslim as the secret agent who is stealing social jouissance from us. For that reason also, the notion of fantasy is ambiguous. Beatific fantasy is supported by a disturbing paranoid fantasy, which tells us why things went wrong. Traversing, going through the fantasy, means we accept the vicious circle of revolving around the void of the object and find jouissance in it, renouncing the myth that jouissance is amassed somewhere else. So I'll just kind of skim through this quote. According to Zizek, fantasy has both a beatific side, which is fantasy one, a stabilizing dimension. This would be American exceptionalism or pseudo-patriotism more specifically, which is governed by the dream of a state without disturbances, out of reach of human depravity, sort of a perfect state, right? And a destabilizing dimension, whose elementary form is envy. In this sense, fantasy conceals the Cartesian gap between thinking and being, right? Thinking that one is perfect, one is exceptional, but being Islamophobic in reality. Let us then apply this veil to Islamophobia. So hopefully you have read this quote. So in conclusion, this is sort of an alternative framework that puts a positive spin on Islamophobia because it can be a very, someone I think talked about how it can be a draining topic and for scholars and etc. So this is a way for me to kind of think about myself as a scholar activist and how I can put a positive spin on Islamophobia. So in conclusion, I invite you all to consider Islamophobia not only as a discursive effect, but more importantly as a material counter-discourse. Musa and Skap clarify what this Turdemanian notion means when, quote, when the formerly voiceless begin to speak a language of their own making, a counter-discourse, they have begun to resist the power seeking to oppress them. In this narrow sense, the very act of speaking is political. This type of scholar activism aims at clearing a space in which the formerly voiceless might begin to articulate their desires. In this sense, Islamophobia studies is a counter-discourse, countering the domination of prevailing authoritative discourses, such as the war on terror. And this conference is exemplary of practical theorizing in action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I think that really sort of feeds well to the two speakers we've heard already, thinking about organizing around these concepts as sort of a positive action, rather than Islamophobia as just listing off the ways in which we are subject to forces that maybe we don't want to be subject to. So thank you.